My name is Matthew Johnson. I'm the Director of Education for Media Smarts, HabiloMédias, Canada's Centre for Digital and Media Literacy. As Director of Education, I'm responsible for the creation of our educational resources, our parent materials, our interactive resources, and I'm also involved in all of the research we do about young Canadians in a networked world. So this morning I was talking about how, in order to address misinformation, we need to recognize the network nature of today's media. We need to build on the base of traditional media literacy, to build on things that have worked for 3 decades, but also recognize what has changed with the network nature of modern media and how we need to find networked solutions that we can teach to young people that use the strengths of digital media in order to overcome all of the new challenges that it poses.
You talked about checking the importance to check the sources. So what would be the different way for a child with the internet to check the sources?
Well, there are a number of different ways. I mean, one of the simplest ones is simply to follow links. So when we get news via social media, it is important to follow the links to where that piece of news came from. And often that will bring you to the original source. When it's something like a photo, there are a lot of tools available like reverse image search, which can be a really quick way of finding out whether, for instance, something that's happening connected to a news story is actually happening now, or whether it's an old photo that's been repurposed. And of course, when things do get more complicated, we can use more advanced tools like a news search on Google that we can sort by date, so we can find out where something actually originated, where a news story or a source of information first appeared, and so we can evaluate that source.
You also talk about the Russia Today, who is using maybe with the run by the government of Russia, so it will be more the propaganda of the regime, in this newspaper. So maybe what can difference the propaganda, the fact to just keep the positive aspect of a news, and fake news? What is the difference, if there is a difference?
Well, one of the really interesting things about some of the misinformation campaigns that are happening today is they try to build a better reputation by mixing genuine content with misinformation. And so a lot of these channels, whether it's something like RT or whether it's some of the YouTube channels that have been established, even accounts on Twitter that are promoting false information, in a lot of cases they bury or they mix that false information or misinformation with genuine information to make them more trusted. In some cases, they actually create entirely alternate identities. So there were a number of false Twitter accounts that were found recently that actually had been posing as people on the left to build followers on the left. And then in the run-up to the US elections, they were going to be using that as a vehicle to spread misinformation from the perspective of the right. So that's why it is important, first of all, that we go through the source. So RT, for instance, when it does share legitimate information, it's usually things that they're sharing from somewhere else, because again, there's no cost to it. So they can share, as in the example that I gave this morning, they can share a funny video. The video may turn out to be true, and if you're not careful to follow that up to the source, it enhances your sense of RT's credibility. And that's why it's important to get a consensus sense of how reliable a source is, and also to have an idea of what the purpose of the source is and what their business model is. So if it is a source that has accuracy and reliability as part of its business model, then you're going to be more inclined to trust it. You're going to give it more of your trust than a source that is giving the things away for free or that is known as being a propaganda organ.
And what is the impact of the media evolution of media in the way to reading the news?
I think the biggest impact is that we don't get all of our news stories from a limited number of sources. And there's been research that was done at the University of Toronto that looked at this, and it did find that most young Canadians who read the news, quite a few do read the news, but they don't typically read it from a single source. They encounter news stories online, frequently through social media. And then if they're interested, they'll follow that to the original source. But at the same time, what that means is that rather than getting news that has been curated by a newspaper, by a TV news broadcast, we're getting it from a wide variety of sources. Some of those depend on who our friends are or people that we've chosen to follow. Some of them are algorithmically determined, what Twitter or Facebook or whatever social network or search engine chooses to show you. There are advantages and disadvantages to this because, of course, in the old model, you read the news that was in the newspaper, and if it wasn't in the newspaper, you didn't know about it. And so there is the potential in this new model to get news that we wouldn't have gotten otherwise. At the same time, there was in the old system that what I call provenance, that you knew where it was coming from. So when I look at the New York Times and the National Enquirer, I'm not necessarily going to trust them both equally, but I can trust that I know the difference between the New York Times and the National Enquirer. I can bring my judgment of their relative trustworthiness when I'm reading them. But when I'm getting news online, it's not easy to tell. Can't automatically tell the difference between a story that came to me from the New York Times and a story that came to me through the National Enquirer. I have to do a little bit of effort. And so some of that work that used to be done for us by those gatekeepers, that work of provenance, is something that falls to us now. And so we have to train young people to do it.
And so what would be like all the advice for teacher, because we talked about like all in the conference for education. Mm-hmm. So what would be your advice for teacher, like how to really teach, how to don't believe like the fake news?
Well, the strength of the key concepts approach is that you don't need to feel like you are a subject expert to be able to teach. That's something that we've had tremendous success with, teaching the original key concepts of media literacy for 3 decades now. Where if you begin from those few basic ideas, the idea that media are constructed, that they have commercial considerations, that they have social and political implications, no matter how disposable they may seem, that audiences negotiate media, so different audiences take a different meaning, and that each medium is a unique form, and that the form of the medium influences the content. That's enough to put in the hands of teachers. Those 5 basic concepts, these can be applied to any form of media, and they can be adapted everywhere from kindergarten up to grade 12. And so what we've introduced with our key concepts of digital literacy are parallels that apply in addition to those. They don't replace the original key concepts, but in addition to those, we have implications of the fact that modern digital technology is networked. And so when you understand that idea of the network, when you understand the idea that this means that content now is tremendously shareable, that sharing is now the default rather than the exception, when you understand the ways in which the tools that we use influence not just the content but how we use them, when you understand the interactive nature means that what we do online, what we do with digital media has an impact, it has an ethical dimension in a way that using traditional media didn't really. These, again, can be applied to your own context. They can be applied to any grade level. Now, we have a full comprehensive digital literacy curriculum that we offer from kindergarten to grade 12, or for the primary, secondary system in Quebec. And this does have lessons in 7 different aspects. So if a teacher or a school board wanted to, they could do a full curriculum for the entire school career of a student with our lessons. But the value of the key concepts is that they don't have to rely on our resources, and also that if they want to modify those resources to their context, they have in those key concepts essentially a guiding star to help them understand what they're supposed to be achieving with these lessons and activities.